Hello everybody. We're about to kick off Planet Earth as ATM, fighting commodification of the commons, and we will be collectively speaking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have lots of time to have a discussion and a debate about why this is happening and what we can do to oppose it and why we should be opposing it. I was going to normally buy USA Today, but yesterday, as I was coming here, I noticed the front cover has, this will only get worse. Louisiana is shrinking as climate change softens up the already vulnerable Gulf Coast. That's a pretty extensive series of comments and analysis of what's happening in Louisiana as they lose a football field of land every single day to the oceans, and lots of places that used to be able to walk on are now underwater. So what are the ramifications for that? And they come up with a 50-year plan, while never mentioning climate change, of course. Some people are questioning whether 50 years is actually enough. Maybe we should have a 1,000-year plan for the kind of changes that we are bringing to the planet. And so I think this whole segment of the conference couldn't be more timely, because my contention is that we can't really have meaningful social change without some meaningful ecological change. And we're not going to get any social justice without some ecological justice. The two things are inextricably intertwined. And so we've got to fight on both fronts. And one of those fights is about the commodification of the commons. So I'm going to talk about that for about 15 minutes or so. This is just how I like to have my classes, actually, in nice regimented rows. Yes, where the experts are at the front and we talk to you. But hopefully, despite the layout of this classroom, which doesn't show much 21st century thinking, that's for sure, despite that, hopefully we'll have a more inclusive conversation about it. So, I'll introduce myself briefly. I'm going to facilitate things and make sure things keep on track a little bit. And then I will be introducing the other speakers, Rachel from Biofuelwatch and Julie, individually as we go along when they do their presentations. So, to begin with, on June 24th, 2012, the last surviving member of Calanoidis nigra abingdoni exhaled for the last time. In the place made famous as the evolutionary laboratory that gave Charles Darwin his insights into the central theoretical premise that underlies the whole of biology. Lonesome George, last survivor of his subspecies, expired quietly 1,000 kilometers off the coast of Ecuador on the Galapagos Islands. Galapagos meaning saddle in Spanish, because there were so many of them when the Spanish arrived. It seemed logical to name them after the tortoise's shells. And then Lonesome George was an incredible beach that I had the good fortune to see in the flesh a few years ago, well, many years ago now. He was only approximately 100 years old, and so he was essentially in the prime of his life. Giant tortoises can be expected to live for well over 200 years. Nobody really knows why he died. Maybe he just died because he got unable to sustain himself as being the last. He got tired of being the last of his kind. A little before George was born, the ramifications of such an extinction were expressed in human terms by Hunkpapa resistance leader Sitting Bull. Quote, "A cold wind blew across the prairie when the last buffalo fell, a death wind for my people." These tortoises have existed on Earth for around about 10 million years, practically unchanged, and yet it took less than the lifespan of one of them to exterminate them all. In contrast, Homo sapiens have only been on the Earth for around about 200,000 years, a mere 2% of that time. In the world as it currently exists, the extinction of Calanoidis nigra abingdoni leaves us not with the question, will we learn, but rather, what will be next? Perhaps it will be another primordial leviathan, this time of the deep. I've had the further good fortune to work on the conservation of leatherback turtles. They are listed as critically endangered by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the world's largest and oldest conservation organization. It's on the red list of threatened species. And once you get placed, recognized as critically endangered, that's one step from extinct in the wild. These creatures, leatherback turtles, relics of a long ago distant past, colossal behemoths of the unfathomable abyss, have put to shame, actually, giant tortoises by a factor of 10. They've been around on the Earth practically unchanged for 100 million years, which puts Homo sapiens pale into temporal insignificance next to leatherback longevity. The leatherbacks are over 6 feet long, 4 feet wide. They can weigh up to a ton, same as an SUV. They can dive to 3,600 feet, which is 3 times deeper than a nuclear submarine can go. And they can regulate their own body temperature to cope with the cold and the pressure. And to sit on a dark tropical beach, kind of listening to the heaving motion of one of these mothers as they lay their eggs, you're relocating them, is really one of the most deeply affecting moments of natural wonder. Why am I telling you this? Because one of the ways in which we are said to be able to, the best way we're going to be able to conserve these magnificent creatures is through commodifying them, is by privatizing and taking stock in a financialization venture of how much they're really worth to us as human beings. So, across the political spectrum, really, this is an increasingly prevalent argument that the single most best and effective way of saving leatherbacks and all the other species that are threatened or under threat with extinction, and many other things, is to financialize and commodify them. Now that sounds kind of ludicrous when you think about what is the value of a leatherback turtle as you sit next to one on a dark tropical beach. But rather than some madcap scheme from Dr. Strangelove, this idea is gaining more and more traction, not just amongst corporations, but amongst many environmental NGOs and the UN. Now, obviously, we can take some pretty easy and educated guesses about why corporations might be all for this idea. And so Stuart Hall, writing in the Harvard Business Review, argues that, quote, corporations are the only organizations with the resources, the technology, the global reach, and ultimately the motivation to achieve sustainability. By selling solutions to global ecological breakdown, capitalization of nature can be seen as one of the biggest biggest commercial opportunities in the history of business. While protecting the environment was previously seen as an impediment or a restriction to free trade, the regulations lacked the flexibility needed for neoliberal capitalism, the discourse has really been changed to one of the earth as money. It's not just the corporations that are doing this. The UN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature that I quoted earlier, are all advocating the same thing, as are many environmentalists, and sometimes in literal terms. So the logo of the United Nations Environment Programme's New Green Deal Initiative, if you go and check it out online, depicts a delicate but healthy young plant rising up from a pile of euro coins. The symbolism being that plants can grow just as well when planted in money as they can in soil. Similarly, the IUCN has an image on their Payment for Ecosystems Services document of luxurious and fertile leaves in a forest, with some of the leaves transformed into monetary bills, as if money is growing from the plant itself. So it's hard to avoid the symbolism of what they're trying to say. But obviously in the context of neoliberalism, that all forms of government intervention, planning, and the public realm are anachronistic and inefficient. That the market is the best way to solve all of our humanity's problems, then the most effective way to save these magnificent creatures and thousands of other species along the way is to commodify nature. So it's not that market relations cannot account for nature, apparently. It's just that the accounting system was not really set up properly in the first place. Putting the correct price, otherwise known as internalizing the cost of a natural good, to make it possible not just for its rational exploitation, but simultaneously for its conservation. We'll both be able to use it and save it at the same time, if we only put a price on it. Looked at another way, if something is not scarce, if it's plentiful and abundant, it has no value to capitalism. You can look at how the system limits healthcare, education, housing, jobs, etc. I mean, is it really feasible or believable that a country as rich as the United States cannot build enough hospitals, schools, or houses for people? The idea is ridiculous. Conversely, the scarcer a resource is, obviously, the more profitable it can be. So for this reason, that's why sections of capital will inevitably start making money from environmental degradation, as they are already doing, and that will generate new areas. Rather than a questioning of the underlying logic, that will simply generate new areas for profitable investment and further capital accumulation. To quote anthropologist Sean Sullivan, quote, "Capital needs to create new natures that it can see, requiring that the earth in crisis is rethought and reworded such that it is brought further into alignment conceptually, semiotically, and materially with capital." The quantification of nature is the rational endpoint, really, I would argue, of capitalism's philosophical approach to nature, and consequently a way of saving it. The non-quantifiable qualitative side of nature, the purely spiritual, the awe-inducing beauty of kind of sitting quietly on a rock, watching the sunrise over the horizon in a 4.5 billion year old revolutionary dance, is not only unquantifiable from capitalism's perspective, but furthermore, it is essentially unknowable. So that's why the UN deliberations at Rio+20, the Earth Summit 20 years later, last year in 2012, all revolved around the concept of the green economy, something called the green economy, which came out of a 631-page UN document. From a Marxist perspective, the ideas within society are a reflection of how the society functions, and those ideas are then picked up and promoted by those who run the system in their own interests. So it's not surprising that on the flip side of that, the defense of land held in common, the reappropriation of public space, is precisely about people saying enough is enough. And if you look at the revolt in Turkey, the rebellion in Brazil, Occupy, Zuccotti Park, everything else that's going on around the world, it's about saying we actually want open space for the use of everybody without its financialization, to benefit not for money, but for doing useful things, for meeting people, for interacting, for building relationships, relationships amongst people, as opposed to relationships amongst amongst things. And so this is not just a historical, obviously prior to capitalism, everything was held in common, but certainly prior to that in non-class societies. But this is a contemporary situation as much as it is a historical one, with ongoing land grabs and many other things that people will probably talk about. 1.7 billion people, predominantly in the global south, still live as subsistence farmers directly from the land. So we're talking about an enormous number of people. So robbing people here, in contemporary terms, is about robbing the poor and people of color predominantly. And so, to underline the point I made earlier about the UN green economy, let me really quote from their report. "Biodiversity, the living fabric of this planet, includes life at all levels, genes, species, and ecosystems. At each of these levels, biodiversity contributes to human well-being and provides economies with valuable resource inputs. These so-called ecosystem services are mostly in the nature of public goods and services whose economic invisibility has thus far been a major cause of their undervaluation, mismanagement, and ultimately resulting loss." So the biosphere is now a service. We are its customers. And the only real problem with this whole worldview is that we've been doing a little bit of shoplifting along the way. And we just need to change that a little bit. So, for example, how does the UN Environment Programme cost out the amount that is for us from bee pollination, insect pollination, for example? In their report, they placed that at $190 billion. So, of course, you can, figure out some other way of replacing bees, and you get back your $190 billion. Forget about the interconnections between bees and all kinds of other things. Merriam-Webster defines the word service from the Latin servitium as the condition of slave, body of slaves. In other words, the concept formalizes Francis Bacon's 17th century view of nature when he declared, quote, "I am come in very truth, leading to you nature with all her children, to bind her to your service and make her your slave." So there are many, many other UN and other initiatives related to commodification nature, which Rachel and Julie, I think, are going to talk about. But through this process, not only are we going to stop biodiversity loss, reverse climate change, we're going to also solve poverty according to the UN, and then they turn around and have the goal to call socialists utopian. Going further abroad than that, Gavin Power, the Deputy Director of the UN Global Compact, an umbrella group of some of the 45 most powerful CEOs in the world, Coca-Cola, GlaxoSmithKline, Nestle, Merck and Bayer. You might recognize them as environmental stewards in another context. He says, talking about the privatization of water, quote, "For companies, this is enlightened self-interest. Those who can afford water should pay. Water is essentially overexploited because we are not valuing it as an economic good. Introducing methodologies such as escalating tariffs, which some countries have already done, will help in terms of using water intelligently, often for the first time." So human beings in our 200,000 year history could not ever, for the first time, have used water intelligently until we learned how much it cost. Simon Greenspan, talking on the London Stock Exchange last year, he works for commodity broker Tullett Brown. When our analysts were looking for the next area of great growth, it was fairly obviously that it was the planet. It was the environment. The preservation of the planet allows us to give our clients what they truly seek, which is sustainable returns for many years to come. From the perspective of the money men, the last resort needs to be transformed into capital. This is a report from the Financial Times. Citibank's chief economist, William Buter, thinks that in the next couple of decades, water will be a more significant market player than oil. Where he says, quote, "I expect to see a globally integrated market for fresh water within 25 to 30 years. Once the spot markets for water are integrated, futures markets and other derivative water-based financial instruments, puts, calls, swaps, both exchange-traded and OTC, will follow. There will be different grades and types of fresh water, just the way we have light, sweet, and heavy sour crude oil today. Water as an asset class will, in my view, become eventually the single most important physical commodity-based asset class, dwarfing oil, copper, agricultural commodities, and precious metals." So the logic of this position is, well, horrendous to say the least. And I think it should be pretty obvious that based on the way that capitalism works, this is the direction that they want to go, because they've run out of other profitable areas to make money from. And so if they can, this is the kind of final frontier in terms of where they can next make their money from. Turning each individual piece of nature into an individual piece of a commodity for exchange. And so the question really, I think, becomes, as George Monbiot, the environmental writer, goes, "Rarely will the money be made by protecting nature, match the money to be made by destroying it. Nature offers low rates of return by comparison to other investments. If we allow the discussion to shift from values to value, from love to greed, we cede the natural world to the forces wrecking it." And so what do we need to oppose this? As Green Party eco-socialist Derek Waller said, we need to resurrect the idea of usufruct, which is an old word meaning that you can use something as long as you don't wreck it for the future. And Marx talked about the exact same concept in Capital, Volume 1, where he said, "All societies taken together are not owners of the globe, they are only its possessors, its usufructuaries. And like good heads of household, they must hand it down to succeeding generations in improved condition." And obviously the notion of succeeding generations is set deep within Native American culture in terms of the seven generation rule. And that's clearly what we need to be thinking about. Unfortunately, capitalism doesn't do forward thinking, doesn't actually do thinking or planning of any kind. And so my argument would be, and I'll finish with this, is that if we actually want, ultimately, if we really want to live in a socially just and ecologically sustainable society, then we have to completely extract the profit motive as the driving force. In other words, rather than basing a society on competition to the highest bidder and profit, where we all compete against each other for everything that we have, and there's complete lack of any meaningful democracy, then we need to live in a completely different world and a way of organizing, which means we should be cooperating with each other to make things that we need, as opposed to things that we just make money from. And so that means that we need to actually, in my opinion, get rid of capitalism. I noticed that University of Wisconsin has an online master's, bachelor's, and certificate in something called Balancing People, Planet, and Profit, which is, which I would argue is not only unbalanced, but is something that is unbalanceable. And so I think we need to actually, as has been argued elsewhere, kind of extract that profit and turn it into more, what are we doing thinking about people and planet for the future. Thanks very much. So next we have Rachel Smolker, who is co-director of Biofuelwatch and works to expose and oppose the impacts of large-scale bioenergy on public health, biodiversity, and climate. And just to say, I forgot to introduce myself, but I'm Chris Williams, and I have a book on ecology and socialism, and appear in many different places online and in print. And I'm currently working on a book on the commons, and I'm on sabbatical this year because I'm on fellowship to work on that. So that's me. Over to Rachel.
No, we don't. Want to go finish it? You don't need the light on, do you?
Sure, yeah. Thanks everybody for coming in, for listening to us, and thanks Chris for that great introduction. I think some of what I'm going to do is lay out a little bit of the details of what the landscape of this financialization looks like for those who may not be as familiar with it. And just start out saying, John Bellamy Foster and others have described that the appropriation of the commons is an integral aspect of capitalism. And capitalism is always looking for new means of producing profit from activities that were not otherwise managed through commodity relationships. And so this is, the earth, the land, the water. There are now patents on nanotechnology forms of elements on the periodic table. There are patents on seeds and genes, and a huge array of patents recently were filed for climate-ready genes in crops that are likely to become more useful in the future in a warming world, and so on and so forth. It goes on. We are all familiar with the privatization of our education system and our security forces, and so on and so forth. It's all part of this huge wave of putting dollar values on everything and putting it into the hands of those who can afford it, right? Which is mostly not us, probably. So I am the director of an organization, Biofuelwatch. We work internationally and also locally in communities opposing dirty energy facilities. That's a lot of what we do. But we also follow a lot of different issues related to land use, food, and everything that is impacted by the expansion of bioenergy. And one of the things that I wanted to start out with was just talking about Rio Plus 20, which Chris mentioned a little while ago. There was the, how do I raise this? Here? Yeah. The United Nations Environment Program put out this 600-page report that Chris mentioned, which was on the green economy. Now, this green economy report was written in partnership with the Deutsche Bank and the World Bank, just by the way. And their definition of the green economy is it recognizes the value of and invests in natural capital, is central to poverty eradication, creates jobs, enhances social equity, substitutes renewables for fossil fuels, promotes enhanced resource and energy efficiency, delivers more sustainable urban living, low carbon mobility, grows faster than a brown economy, and while maintaining and restoring natural capital. That all sounds pretty good. Via priority spending, regulation, market instruments, innovation, capacity building, and internet investments. So the question we have to immediately ask is, okay, what's, in particular focusing on the market mechanisms right now, what is to be marketed, and how is this green economy going to be powered? First of all, carbon is to be marketed, and we all know that carbon is basically pervasive in all of life, and it's something that's largely intangible. There was an article in the Interpol just a couple of days talking about all the frauds and failures associated with the carbon markets, and basically they said the problem is that carbon is just so intangible. It's impossible to really measure where it's going, where it's coming from, and so on, and so it's incredibly vulnerable to fraud. And we could have told people, we've been telling that. I think people in the climate justice movement have been saying that for 10, 15 years now, at least. We were concerned that this would be the case, and it's proven true now. The EU emissions trade scheme, which is the biggest carbon market, has utterly failed at this point, failed to reduce emissions, had been just fraught with all kinds of problems. And the price of carbon is so low now. The companies that were taking place in this great game of commodifying carbon have profited from their participation in this market, but we haven't reduced emissions in the process. The Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM, sorry for the acronyms, but is through the Kyoto Protocol's mechanism for offsetting and marketing carbon. The CDM has supported all kinds of destructive projects, including trash incineration and a big boondoggle with HFCs, which are extremely damaging compounds from refrigeration. By paying people to destroy HFCs, they encourage the production of more HFCs because you can get rich making them and destroying them. So that backfired a bit. And then there's always the carbon in forests. We could trade and market that as well. So there's been a lot of discussion. We need to protect forests. We know that deforestation is a major contributor to climate change. So if we can protect forests, that would be good. And of course, to do that, the grand idea has been to use forests as offsets. So some polluter with a coal plant up somewhere in the north can pay someone somewhere in the south in a tropical region to protect a piece of their forest, and then they can just keep on polluting and call it a well, it's at best a zero-sum game, right? We need to be reducing emissions, not offsetting emissions in one place for emissions in another place. But actually, they don't even go that far in general. REDD, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, is the acronym for that discussion. In California, there was a recent proposal for under the AB 32 or whatever it is, the climate legislation in California, where they tried to get a REDD program going with a memorandum of understanding between Chiapas, of all places, and Acre, Brazil, in California. I just recently, in the process of preparing this talk, found out that Shell Oil has just recently bought pieces of forest in Michigan and in Alberta, Canada, as a means of offsetting their emissions from tar sands extraction in Alberta. So, you know, it gets really absurd after a while. So that's using forests, but then there's been a lot of discussion about expanding REDD to REDD+ and REDD+++ and REDD++++, which would extend REDD and the idea of using landscapes and forests and ecosystems as offsets to agriculture, to soils, and to entire landscapes and ecosystems. We got involved in that because we were looking at biochar, which is one of the things proposed as an offset for emissions, and biochar doesn't work, and if you want to talk to me afterwards about that, I'll be happy to do that. I'm going to go into the next slide. This is, as I said, we've been saying this for years. This is me getting arrested under the Chicago Climate Exchange. Me and 12 other people years ago at a big protest about the carbon market through the Chicago Climate Exchange. Another, piece of the big commodification puzzle has been, the idea of payments for ecosystem services and biodiversity offsets. Payments for ecosystem services meaning, if you have a watershed, you can pay the people on there not to destroy the watershed because the water then serves us, provides us with a service. And that has been tried in Costa Rica, it's been tried in various other places. And again, the question is, what value do you put on a watershed? What value do you place on it? Biodiversity offsets is more the case where you have a company that wants to, say, come in and build a big dirty facility somewhere. They're going to destroy, say, a wetland. And so they instead say, well, we'll pay for the protection of a wetland somewhere else in order to give us the right to destroy this wetland here. Or we'll, do something to offset the destruction in one place by doing something elsewhere. Again, the question is, what is the value of biodiversity? I wanted to move on and talk a little bit about public-private partnerships, because these are ever more pervasive. In the UN, where I've sort of watched it, there's a whole bunch of new. I should start out by saying that Friends of the Earth International put out a publication. They sort of gathered it all together in one place. I think it was in front of at the Durban climate negotiations or around there. Kind of pulling it all into place. The UN has sort of been increasingly rolling out the red carpet to industry and saying, oh, we have a problem with climate, so we need to get the industry and the corporations all in here and tell us how to do it. Or biodiversity is lost, we need to get industry in here and tell us how to do it. And their place at the table within these negotiations and these debates has just grown ever more strong and powerful and present, to the point that they're running the show anymore. So within, like, for example, and they form these partnerships with UN agencies, and then they are able to influence how those initiatives are run and managed. Examples include the International Fund for Agriculture Development, which is partnered with the Gates Foundation, which is very close in bed with Monsanto and DuPont and so on. Other examples, I mentioned before, Deutsche Bank and the World Bank writing this report on the green economy, basically saying, oh, this will be, clearly they're banks. They're saying it's going to be very profitable for us to have this discourse about the green economy. And so they have their place at the table to do that. The Global Compact with it, which again, Chris has already mentioned, this is essentially the way that the corporations, as I understand it, have come in and basically said, we're going to take over the process of regulating corporations. We'll regulate ourselves. We'll develop an initiative. It's all voluntary, but it'll be just fine. There's no sanctions. We don't want to punish anybody, and it's just basically greenwash. They have this thing that says, we're regulated when, of course, they're not. And so there's other bodies like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the International Chamber of Commerce, all of whom are in there forming partnerships and working within the UN in these initiatives. And just to quote that report from FO International, so this access provides corporations with a welcome opportunity to influence the policy agenda and protect their interests, not in the conservation of nature, as Chris has very articulately said, but in securing access to natural resources and ensuring their business model is not threatened by the introduction of new environmental regulations, maximizing profits and limiting costs. One of the public-private partnerships that I have spent most time looking at a little bit more closely is called Sustainable Energy for All. So this was announced by the Secretary General. We're going to have a new initiative. We need to alleviate energy poverty. We need to provide energy to all of the people living in poverty who don't have access to electricity and so on. Well, that's all, the language of sustainable development and poverty alleviation and so on and so forth. So the first thing they did, they announced this initiative, and then they sat down with Exxon and Mobil and BP and all the big hydro dam constructors and so on and so forth, and said, how should we do this? And would you like us to do this? And they said, quote unquote, this is not about charity. Right? They made that very clear. This is about profit making, and that's who they consulted with first off. And then they went out and they said, oh, we're going to have consultations with you, and we want you from the NGO community and civil society and indigenous people all to tell us how you'd like this done. It's going to be very nice. It's going to be very good for you, but it's not about charity, I must say. So, it's very insidious, and it's sickening to watch, really. It's just sickening. The initial, okay, the initial commitments under this, one of the very first ones was Ghana with an LNG pipeline through the country. So the other thing is they call this a Sustainable Energy Initiative. They do not, and they're very clear about this, tell anybody what to do. So it's called sustainable energy, but you can have nukes, you can have more efficient fossil fuel burning, you can have pretty much any form of energy you want. They don't want to tell countries what to do. What they want to do, essentially, is to, let me just move to the next slide, so there's a quote on there. So this is the kind of imagery you see on their website, of course, and you wouldn't know that behind that is Statoil and Eskom and so on. They're providing solar cells for poor women in Ghana. This quote, private sector leadership is fundamental. Government's role is to create enabling policy and environmental, and policy and environmental environments, to spur private investment. So it's about creating the policies and allowing investors to go in there and put their infrastructure into place and create new markets. It's not about providing cooking fuel for poor people who are having trouble cooking their meals. It's not about providing electricity to hospitals. It's presented in that terms, but it's not. The next part, excuse me, that I wanted to touch on is how are we going to power this so-called green economy? And as I said, I'm the director of Biofuelwatch, and I have spent a lot of time fighting back against the expansion of biofuels and bioenergy. What most people don't realize is that the lion's share of renewable energy is, there's a lot of wind and solar in different regions, but bioenergy is huge. And we know a lot of, I've heard quite a bit now at this point about the impact of biofuels for transportation on food, because we're burning 40% of our corn crop in the United States and turning it into ethanol right now. We've finally got a lot of publicity, and a lot of people are recognizing, even the World Bank has now said, maybe it wasn't such a good idea making these mandates for transportation biofuels. It's had a huge impact on food prices and on the entire sort of domino effect through agriculture. But what people are less aware of is burning of biomass for electricity. And that's something that we've been working on a lot recently. And this is, of course, just one of the ways that there's energy in the green economy. We're going to power the green economy is by burning and basically using plants as a substitute for fossil energy. And some people refer to that not as the green economy, but as a bioeconomy. And it includes not just biofuels for transport, but burning wood from trees for electricity, producing chemicals. The chemical industry actually has its own mandate for transferring from petroleum-based to plant-based. Bioplastics, bioproducts of all manner, clothing, carpeting, construction materials, you name it, can be. If it's made from petroleum or fossil fuels, there's a way to do it from living plant material, because the chemistry is not so foreign. And what is required in order to do that in many cases is the growing massive quantities of biomass, collecting, harvesting, refining it, using synthetically derived microbes from synthetic biology to create enzymes that will break down the plant material and basically spew it out into other forms that are more useful for us to turn into energy. And it also includes using a lot of GMOs, including genetically engineered trees, which has become a big issue here in the United States recently with recent push to commercialize genetically engineered eucalyptus and grow massive plantations of these to feed this bioeconomy. And what's happened at the national and international level is that we've seen a huge spate of land grabs, particularly in areas of Africa and Asia, where there's the idea now that investors are seeing the profitability because we need all this biomass for the bioeconomy to provide energy for it. We need access to the land to grow that and the water to grow that. So I think it was the International Land Coalition report a few months ago that said something like 250 million hectares of land, particularly in Africa, had been purchased by outside investors, and of that, some proportion, I think it was like 70 million, they were able to really find out more of the details. So of the ones that they really understood what the reason for these land grabs were, about half, slightly more than half, I think, were for biofuel, bioenergy plantations. So the demand for all this biomass to fuel the ongoing production, as if we're going to keep on making stuff, and we're going to keep on, we're going to just keep on doing what we've been doing, and we're just going to substitute plants in there instead. And that's why, Biofuelwatch has been very busy over the years trying to impress upon people that we don't have that amount of land, and trying to pretend that we do is already resulting in huge problems. So in closing, putting a price tag does not represent the value, and pretending that it does is extremely dangerous. I wanted to close by taking a quote from a friend of mine who I've worked with, Helen and Paul from EcoNexus. And I think this is really important because many groups that we work with are sort of a little bit behind the curve in terms of understanding, I think, exactly the scope of what's going on. They kind of go in and sit at the table, they think, oh yeah, bioeconomy sounds good, green's a nice color. They're at the table, they want to get finance, and they're not really fully understanding the scope of what's happening. So she said, in the different areas of my work, I've noticed that because many of the larger NGOs want to sit at the policy table, they accept the issues as framed by those in power, and they also accept the timetable on offer. Yes, we're all there, we're doing the consultations and going to the meetings. And they also accept the timetable on offer. They play each game as it comes along, instead of looking for, seeing, and communicating the wider picture or looking ahead to see what's coming. They're also looking for funding, and they're prepared to compromise. Ecosystems can't be converted into hierarchies of services, some more useful to capital than others. Our understanding of ecological processes is at the kindergarten stage, even so far advanced. The idea that we can place a financial value on these processes would be funny if it were not such a tragedy. Biodiversity is being rapidly destroyed by the current economic paradigm and will continue until the paradigm changes. So it's time to get with the game and change the paradigm. All right, thank you so much.
All right, thanks very much. What could possibly go wrong with corporations self-regulating? So, Julie Enslow has her roots in activism from the civil rights and Vietnam War era. She's founder and former staff person with Peace Action in Wisconsin, concentrating on nuclear assault and anti-war work. She is co-founder of Milwaukee Chapter 350.org, and she now concentrates on global climate change. Recently attended the World Social Forum in Tunisia with climate activists from around the world.
Hi, everybody. This is a rather overwhelming subject. And this past spring, I was in Tunisia at the World Social Forum, and I concentrated on their climate change area there, which turned out to be probably the largest area of interest in the World Social Forum this year. My instincts, I guess most all of my adult life, have been to question a lot of these things that we see happening now. And to finally start to see it all put together was pretty devastating in many respects, but also kind of reaffirming my suspicions and my instincts, which made me think, well, I guess maybe I'm not crazy. This stuff really is happening this way. I think I can probably just do this, sure. Basically, the World Social Forum, I'll just tell you a little bit about, I think this is about the 12th World Social Forum, and it's been held all over the world. I went representing 350.org, which we started in Milwaukee just this past winter, but it's all over the world. And actually, it's based on the fact that 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is what they figure is the top limit of CO2 that will allow life to sustain itself on this planet as we know it now. And until the early 1800s, the average CO2 was 275 in the atmosphere. It is now, in this past May, been declared to be at 400 parts per million CO2. So we've got to get back to 350 and below that if we possibly can to try to get this thing under control. So the CO2 now is actually in every single country in the world except North Korea. The 350.org group is. And people realize around the world that we're reaching the tipping point. And CO2 in the atmosphere. So that's why the World Social Forum, this is the main poster from the Social Forum, which is based really on the whole idea of dignity of human beings and our life and our respect for the planet. It was a very, very big subject to this conference. So 50,000 people from over 5,000 organizations and from 127 countries were there. And the climate space area was the one that, as I say, was a huge focal point. These are just a glimpse of the various groups that coordinated the climate space. None of the great big organizations that you might think of, Friends of the Earth or some of these things. But there were really grassroots organizations from around the world that came together and put this part of the social forum together. And the climate space was a huge area of this campus in Tunisia. And the main theme was systemic change, not climate change. So they really were clear that capitalism is just not compatible with climate justice. And everybody in the world gets that, except here in this country. It was pretty remarkable. I mean, here I've had friends from 350 would say, oh, when you talk about this stuff, don't use the term capitalism, because that might turn people off in this country. And I said, no, we've got to tell the truth. We simply have to tell the truth. And this particular symbol was everywhere. So I came to this conference being totally ignorant of REDD, and everyone was going on with these stickers on their church. I mean, all over this social forum. And I say, what is REDD? I come home and it turns out none of my people in the environmental movements I work with knew what REDD was either. I think 2 or 3 of them knew about it. And so it's been mentioned here. Rachel talked about it. And I'll go into it a little bit more too. And again, it was very clear that when we talk about a green economy group, they were definitely, it's about money. It's about the color of the dollar bill. That's what the green economy is about. And so the commodification and financialization of nature was really an overriding theme that I could pick out from all of the various workshops at the World Social Forum, that we're talking about various aspects of it, but that was basically what holds it all together. That's what is happening. And I think Chris did a really good job in talking about that. And we're acquainted with privatization happening, and of course with Monsanto and the seeds and all. And so food is definitely become commodified that way. Water is next. We also heard the same statistics that you heard before, that oil will no longer be the highest commodity on the planet, the most profitable, but water is going to be the main commodity that is going to be marketed, and is going to overtake oil within the next 10, 20 years. Cap and trade, you've heard about. I'm not going to go into that in a great deal because you've just heard quite a bit about it, but I want to go a little bit more into REDD, which is a really good example of what happens with something like cap and trade, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. So when you start to have these global financial markets to price and trade carbon pollution, is what cap and trade is about. You look at, say, 20% of the world economies have cap and trade in place now, and includes the European Union, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Quebec province. China's moving forward with it in some of its provinces, and California is the one state in the United States that has voted to move into carbon trading, and perhaps with Australia, perhaps with Quebec province. But the U.S. Senate, since it didn't, and Congress, since it doesn't believe in global warming or climate change, refused to support a cap and trade proposal that was presented in front of our Congress. But the only reason that they didn't go for it is because they probably didn't understand how financially useful it might have been to many of them, and they didn't believe it really was a problem to start with. So we get into privatization. Already done some of this. I'll skip this so we can get into it. But the cap and trade ends up and the REDD program legitimizes polluting from the main source, and it sustains the status quo. And it's very difficult to monitor, because how do you monitor carbon? And it really hasn't reduced the amount of carbon in the atmosphere anywhere. When you look at REDD, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, it's basically, the countries in the northern hemisphere that are want to continue their polluting at the present rate. If there's a cap put on what they can emit and carbon emissions, then they want to be able to trade their the carbon with other sources of production, or in this case, nature, that doesn't emit the carbon, so that they can continue to do it on their own, at the level they have been. So it doesn't change anything. The forests that they may purchase a portion of that absorbs carbon, and they're saying that's the trade-off from their emitting carbon. Those forests were there to begin with. They were doing their job, right? Nothing's changed. They're still emitting the carbon from their chimneys in the north and from their power plants, and so that hasn't changed. So basically, this is just it's a phony deal. It's a stupid equation. Nothing really changes. Nothing gets any better, and it just what it does is commodify the forests in the southern part of the hemisphere, predominantly there, and also in some cases in other areas in the north too. But it's just this cycle of carbon credits that goes around, and it's all about money. Who's really affected the most by this is indigenous peoples that live in these forests. And there were many of them that were at the World Social Forum, and they would speak about their own experiences, what's happening to them in their villages and in their tribal communities in the forests that are being affected by this. And they're saying what REDD really means now is reaping profits from evictions, land grabs, deforestation, and destruction of biodiversity. So when they come along with these plans to save these forests, many times they've actually been able to destroy the forests, the people who buy these credits destroy them and replant, saying that then, so they can actually use them for timber sources and replant new plantations of trees on this place. And the commodification, or the use of the trees, such as you said, eucalyptus trees that are being genetically engineered to be more fast-growing, and they plant them in rows. So you get rows of trees instead of a forest. And a plantation is not a forest. We'll have questions and answers in a second. So REDD+ really means, that REDD+ is being used to say that it's gone beyond just forests. And actually, people are buying up plantations in parts of Africa is targeted heavily, South America. And plantations too are being used to as commodities to grow fast-growing plants and to profit from. So people in the north who are trying to get these carbon credits and all are actually profiting more from their these land grabs in the south. Africa is specifically targeted, and it's really, the people in these areas are really organizing against this. To me, the most incredible thing about this was that people from all over the world now, from indigenous communities, are really organizing with one another, and they're communicating. And as much as I kind of dislike having to deal with emails and things all the time, this has really been a means for people to organize throughout the world, and it's very encouraging to see that. And so people were giving their individual testimonies here about the impact of REDD on their lives. And they basically are not allowed to use the forest as they have been, sustainably. If the forests that they thought were theirs are sold out from under them by their governments through this REDD program, which is a UN program, that they are removed from the forest. They're not even allowed to cut down one tree to make a canoe or to build a cabin. They have to totally remove themselves from those forests. They cannot use them for anything, even for gathering in many cases, for hunting and gathering. They're often totally limited as to their access. And so their whole life is destroyed, their whole culture is destroyed, and everything is totally changed to the point where many of them are moving into the cities and losing their culture. And so they're organizing to try to protect this, their way of life, and the genocide of their cultures and of their way of life that's happening as a result of these REDD programs. Even this poster at the social forum, I just thought it was just too great. I thought even Shay got in on this one. But there are a lot of great graphics around this, but Indigenous peoples opposing REDD. And this was one image that I thought really showed how the forest is being guarded by the military, keeping them out, the helicopter up there. They're kept outside of the life that they had, that the forest that they had sustained and knew how to live with in a sustainable manner. They weren't cutting down this forest. They weren't coming in and doing mass removal of trees for timber profits and things. But they now are not allowed to live as they had been in harmony with the forests. So the other big area that they were talking about at the World Social Forum, and that I just was really learning a lot about, there is this whole area of geoengineering. So it's another way of really learning how to profit from this incredible crisis, global crisis that we have, is the deliberate large-scale technological manipulation of the planetary environment. And the people that are behind this are very, very wealthy corporations, very wealthy people, but their heads, some of the people and some of the scientists and engineers involved in this, I think, are seriously concerned about what's going on. They really see that we're in a critical situation on the planet, and that perhaps we really need to do something very, very dramatic to turn things around. But we can't solve the same kind of problems with the thinking we had. And this is the kind of thinking that they have, is that if we inadvertently change the climate, by not advertently try to counterbalance it, instead of changing getting at the source of the problem with the carbon emissions, they want to offer a technological fix, and so that the people that created the climate crisis in the first place can go on as they have. And so the two main areas is to absorb carbon through various techniques, or to reflect the sunshine through various techniques. And my time is up as far as going into this in detail, but during question and answer period, perhaps we can talk a little bit more about some of this geoengineering proposals, because they're serious. There are many, many patents that are out there now for these proposals, and there are people that say within 2-3 years, a lot of these could really be part of reality on our planet, and it's a matter of us determining whether we can stop this in time, because these technical fixes can make things so much worse than what we have at the moment.
But I really haven't seen a lot of socialist organizations tackle environmental issues, and I was just wondering, from your experience, I take it you are a eco-socialist.
Yeah.
What do you see happening in the United States and worldwide in explicit socialist organizations addressing climate?
I can definitely talk about that, because I'm involved in all of that stuff. Yes, in the back.
Yeah. So there's some that think there's double dipping going on with the fracking situation, meaning that it is the false pretense of natural gas to be extracted and only to completely use up our water supply so that water can be sold at a higher rate.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. It's not a question, it's a comment. It's not that long. I think socialism and capitalism is a false dichotomy because it goes on both based on the same principle of the primacy of the human being and its relevance in this environment. In indigenous thinking, which I am and have been involved in for a rather long time, we're just another one of the critters. Our value of each of us is about the same as equivalent weight of shovels of dirt, and there's been about a 10,000-year period of descent into madness from Mesopotamia to Greece and Rome and the other places that have left complete devastation in the wake. The soils are destroyed, the forests are cut down, the rivers dry up, and then once that land no longer sustains life, then 500 years ago, these European peoples brought this way of thinking over here. We actually, Indian people, we think we had it right the first time. There are no objects. There's only subjects out there, not only objects. A tree has its own integrity. Its value as a being and as a tree way exceeds any possible value a living tree could have as lumber. And so all of the living things, and even what we call non-living things, have spirit in them. They are brothers and sisters. They need to be treated with respect. What we're doing here is trying to put Band-Aids on cancer, or maybe a little mercurochrome or something like that. And it's carcinogenic thinking that one group of cells, namely this one, human beings, thinks, oh, we're better than everything else, so we'll just keep multiplying and multiplying and multiplying, and we're all familiar at this point with stage 4 cancer and where that leads us. So what it did through the indigenous environmental network, through Shundahai, that was before that, what we're trying to do is preserve little pieces of nature here and there, the people that are living off of the nature, and then also, for me, combining some of Derek Jensen's ideas, if you want to do something, find a piece of land and protect it. In all of its biological diversity. You buy it, you lease it, partnership, something else. You're not exploiting it. All of the food and fiber we need is there. The most sustainable form of farming is hunter-gathering. The thing is, the population of human beings with pure hunter-gathering on this world would be about 20 million people, but how many people do we need on the planet? I think we think the sustainable limit of human beings with agriculture is about 300 million. So we've got about 20 times as many people on the earth right now as can possibly be sustained in the long run. We could very slowly, we can step back and we could, it can only take not that much time, and we could do it consciously, or, nature's going to take care of it. Nature bats last.
Thank you. Other comments or questions? Otherwise, maybe Julie, you want to answer
Yeah.
stuff related to geoengineering?
Geoengineering, yeah. So it's, geoengineering has to qualify for that term, really, it has to be a very deliberate and extremely large-scale manipulation of the entire planetary environment. That's really is the goal of these projects. And so it really goes way beyond weather manipulation, which we've had for probably 50, 60 years of cloud seeding on this planet. If you remember during the Vietnam War, those of us who remember that we were using cloud seeding in Vietnam was called Project Popeye, and it was seeding the clouds to create massive flooding and very, very intense rainfalls over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and to create, hopefully destroy the rice crops in the north, and it was a war fighting tool, basically. And it's also been used commercially to create rain. And they put silver iodide smoke into the clouds, and it causes them to release the water. So that's one level of weather manipulation, but this goes way beyond that. And so when you look at these technological fixes to absorb the carbon or to reflect the sun, there's various means of absorbing the carbon. One, and the most prevalent kind, is ocean fertilization. That's they put these iron nanoparticles over the surface of the oceans, and large surfaces of the oceans, to increase the production of phytoplankton that would theoretically then sequester the CO2 in the atmosphere, which the plankton requires for its photosynthesis. And then they don't live long, and they would die after, a few days or a week or two, and drop down to the bottom of the ocean. And so the CO2 would go to the floor of the ocean, and they would continue to seed the top of the ocean to produce more and more photoplankton to absorb the carbon out of the air. However, when they've actually experimented with this, and there's been many experiments that have done on small scales, some with quasi-permission, and others just of individual interest groups have done it. They've all failed. It hasn't worked, and they say, well, it's because it's on too small a scale. And so we can't test it on such a small scale because it doesn't work. We have to test it on a huge scale, which is really just doing it to see if it works. So you basically can't test this theory at all unless you just go ahead and say, oh, let's just do it. And what's going to be the consequence of this? They don't really know, because the consequences could be severe. First of all, it's going to totally change the chemistry of the ocean. It's going to change the impact on all forms of life in the ocean. And so it's been really quite an issue that the UN has actually put a temporary ban on these experiments because of the fact that they just aren't sure what the consequences of this would be. However, there are a lot of people that have been promoting this kind of an approach. Another way to absorb carbon as part of the solution would be biochar on a very, very large scale, which Rachel mentioned. And that's basically in Africa, and they're looking at huge tracts. And if you see what's going on in Africa now with land grabs in Africa, it's just amazing. I mean, how many people are buying up, China's buying up huge tracts of land there. European corporations, US, Africa's, it's a new form of colonialization, really, that's happening in Africa with this huge land grab. In fact, they're saying it's more than a land grab. The people that were at the social forum says it's a planet grab that's going on, a planet grab. So this would, by developing massive tree plantations and biomass, they convert it to charcoal, they burn it under special closed conditions that traps the oxygen. And they would then sequester this carbon in the soil, dig it into the soil to, they say, increase soil fertility. And it's being done to some degree already. And the International Biochar Institute fosters investments in and commercialization of the biochar industry. And it turns into an engineering of the soil, geoengineering of the soil. And it has to be done on such a massive scale that it's being included in the area of geoengineering, turning the soils into commodities, to carbon trading and offset mechanisms, massive plantations, genetically engineered trees, patents already applied for, with profits going to corporations. Yeah.
Biofuelwatch has done a lot of the critique of biochar that's out there, and on our website, there are several reports on biochar for anybody who's interested in going into in more detail on this.
Good, good.
Maybe we can take some more.
Yeah, and then the other area is the solar radiation management though, and that's these seawater sprayed into clouds for cloud whitening to reflect more of the sun. And this would affect weather patterns and disrupt ecosystems. Or to construct an artificial clouds over the Arctic region in particular to reflect sunlight. And of course now with the Arctic melting, you have these mass areas that used to be white ice and now they're dark water. And so it's not reflecting the ice, the sun the way it did naturally. And so this is their way of dealing with that. But it would change weather patterns all over the world. They'd be using a sulfate, form of sulfate to see these clouds, and they'd be toxic and would worsen acidification. So then there's all kinds of crazy things that they got out there, like space sunshades, trillions of tiny little spacecrafts in the atmosphere. Covering desert with reflective sheets. They don't care what was under the desert or what impact that would have. But and also engineering plants to have reflective leaves. So all the plants would reflect more sunlight, and space mirrors, putting a super fine reflective mesh up on between the Earth and the Sun. I mean, these are really nuts. And who's funding these? These are they said. One workshop I was at, they said they're billionaires with a Messiah complex that's going to save the earth. These are some of the names that came up.
Who's Russ George?
Russ George is he's an interesting guy. He's he's into this photoplankton.
Phytoplankton.
Yeah, phytoplankton. Yeah,
There was an
plankton.
article just yesterday or so that the CIA is now funding research into planetary geoengineering.
Yeah. So
People-
anyway, that's a little bit more like it.
Take some more comments. People can probably work out for themselves what the real problem with geoengineering is.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, once you start geoengineering, what do you then have to do?
Keep it up.
There is no end point to it,
Yeah.
because you continue,
Yeah.
the point is that allows you to continue putting out carbon emissions, and it's another form of technological offsetting, basically, right? We'll continue to live the way that we are, and we'll just come up with some of these really crazy schemes, and those are not even the craziest ones, but they're all being funded to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. But once you obviously start down that road, you have to continue, let alone the geopolitical implications if, say, China starts manipulating and seeding clouds to make it rain more in China when the surrounding countries get less rain. I mean, what do you think is the outcome of that? Anyway, yes,
So
Bruce.
why is it that anyone would support doing something that's not the obvious thing to do?
It's a great question.
Depends who you're
Perhaps other
talking
people
to,
can
doesn't it?
take that up from the floor. And I'll say a little bit about socialist organizing in a little bit. Other comments or questions that people wanted to?
Well, I
Well,
wanna
you had
add
those
one-
other questions.
Go ahead. I want to add one
Yeah.
thing to that, and I'd say, why doesn't somebody propose that there's a planet out there where it's nirvana? If we get all these people who have so much knowledge, send them there. They won't be back.
Just to comment, basically, the people who are behind all of these proposals for geoengineering are big, say the big billionaires, but there's also, there's major companies like Shell, ExxonMobil, Boeing, British Petroleum, Cargill, God, you just name, there's so many people that they obviously don't care about stopping the source of the problem, which is the carbon emissions. They're not going to go at that. They're going to try to get these technological fixes so they can continue to emit the carbon emissions. Life as usual for them, and then try to fix it so we can at least try to gasp our last breaths on the planet without
engineers love this stuff.
Yeah.
The bomb was just exciting engineering, and let's not worry about what it does, and same thing here. It's fun to work
Yeah,
on.
yeah.
So,
Fix, not change.
Just to get back to your comment about there's another planet out there, Richard Branson, who is
Yeah.
one of the big funders of this, is actually a big player in the privatization of space travel and space tourism. So he's funding geoengineering.
I
It's
hope he
awesome.
takes all these wealthy people out there.
I think there may be some.
So-
He owns Virgin.
Just on the,
I think it's-
the water and hydrofracking issue, and also socialists in the environment and organizing, because whatever you think about capitalism or socialism, the current system is predicated on growth, right? Actually, capitalism doesn't work unless it's continually expanding. And you see that every time there's a recession, then there's got to be cuts to unemployment, social services, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, if you have a system based on exponential growth that only works under that premise, and you live on a finite planet, there is a logical contradiction. We are finding out where the boundaries of that contradiction are right today. And so we clearly need to do something else, because I actually don't think it's a conspiracy. I don't think they think like that at all. If you look at what they're doing in, for example, North Dakota, the Bakken field, where they're fracking for oil, right? So because you can frack for oil just as well as you can frack for gas. And North Dakota, where population is very low, actually is now brighter, or as bright as Chicago. And you can see it from space. And the reason for that is because they are setting fire to all of the natural gas that comes up with the fracked oil.
Yeah.
Because it's just too profitable to bother building pipelines to contain the gas. They might as well just set fire to it.
Oh my God.
And so now North Dakota is as visible from space as Chicago, with a population of 3 million people. The amount of natural gas that they set fire to in the Eagle Field in Texas last year, where they're doing the same thing, was enough to power 400,000 homes for a year. So what they're setting fire to natural gas in the west, that they are fracking for within the same country in the east. There is no planning to capitalism. The different corporations are in competition with each other to produce the most amount of money in the shortest amount of time. So any rationality in terms of, are they colluding with the water companies and privatize it? No, the water companies are working on their own thing.
Right.
And so I don't think it really works like that. In terms of socialists in the environment, I mean, I think the environmental movement has had it for a long time, a problem ever since really the 60s and 70s, where it kind of split along race and class lines, where actually there was a much greater focus on a more biocentric kind of idea, where population was one of the leading problems, said to be one of the leading problems, and saving forests and whales and things like that, which I'm not saying is unimportant, obviously. But that was one track of the environmental movement, and that really didn't leave any space for African Americans and working people in urban areas to actually integrate and be part of.
Yep.
And so in the late 70s and early 80s, you get the rise of what has come to be called the environmental justice movement and organizations, predominantly urban, predominantly people of color, working class people, who are much more concerned with a more anthropocentric view of what we need to do, which is fundamentally have clean air and water so that we can stay alive and don't breathe and drink and eat toxic stuff. So, and I actually don't think that view is incompatible with indigenous ideas about sustainability, and as I quoted from Marx and so on, because we clearly don't need to produce any more than we already have, right? As Gaurav Horowitz quoted yesterday, there's enough money in the United States for every single person to have $200,000 each a year. If it was divided equally. So we've got more than what we need, it's just unequally distributed. So there are loads of industries that we could just completely get rid of. I mean, weapons is obviously one of them, but advertising, marketing, any number of other things that we don't actually need. And redefine what it means to actually be human. Rather than collecting things, we should be collecting relationships, both with each other and with the natural world. Rather than defining ourselves by what we own, we should be thinking about a totally different way of measuring value, right? which is the opposite of what is going on here, right? This is the end point of capitalist ideology, that you monetize everything, whereas what I think what we need to talk about is actually ultimately getting rid of money, because you don't really need it unless you're trying to buy and sell stuff. And I think you have to be very careful, though, and I'm sure you know much more about this than I do. I think you have to be very careful when you talk about indigenous people and knowing the environment and acting on it without having a footprint or something like that, because that can lead into arguments about there was no history to indigenous culture. Because if you don't have an impact on the earth, then you don't have a history. And so that's, i.e., you're the same as the animal kingdom. And I don't believe that's true, and I don't believe that previous cultures, and there's lots of history to this too, have not necessarily negatively impacted the environment by living. On the other hand, it's also true when the first colonists got to New England, and they were like, whoa, where did all these animals come from? How come it's so fertile, and how come so many things live here? And what they ascribed to like an untouched virginal Eden was in fact because the Native Americans made it like that, because of the way that they lived and the edge effect on the way that they burned things and stuff like that. So it can go both ways. I don't think there's some natural virtuosity to indigenous living. I think they're human the same way as everybody else is. But that's not to say we can't take enormous quantities from ways of thought that are, just disregarded under Western thought, and live much more in tune with both ourselves and with the nature around us. Because the idea of codependence, and that we can't actually live without a planet, is completely alien to this system. I mean, as far as they're concerned, they will just keep going. I mean, there's no end point. And just on organizing and activism, I think that's the most important point, because I think the environmental movement is changing a lot and is much more open to the question of justice. Because as soon as you put the word justice into your organization, you're positing two sides, right? There is one side and you're on the other side. And so that means that it's really about power. Because as much as they talk about technological solutions, it's really not at all at this point about technology. I mean, we know what the answers are. It's purely a social and a political question. And even scientists are saying that now, many scientists. And so I think it's much more about, there is a new coalition which I'm part of, so System Change, Not Climate Change, that Jill Stein has been involved in too, that is trying to create a more conscious kind of left wing to the climate movement. I can put you on the list,
yes,
if you give me your email, or anybody else for that matter. There was a conference in New York City in April that Jill and many other people spoke at. Several hundred people were there. Eco-socialism, system change, not climate change. There's about to be another one in LA in September.
When in September?
Sorry?
When in September?
September 21st, I think. But once you get on the listserv, you'll see.
Okay.
And we'd love to have another one in Texas.
Yeah.
So, there are a lot of actually leftists and socialists in Texas. So I think that just like African Americans and many working class people were left behind or out of the mainstream environmental movement through the 80s, that included socialists too, or often the left was pretty disparaging about the environment for a long time too. But I think all of that is changing. And like I said, I don't think you can really address social questions these days without talking about ecological questions and vice versa. And so that's kind of what I'm most involved in, along with my union work and stuff like that.
And just real quick, our group is, the goal was try to bring environmentalists in contact with leftists, and leftists in contact with environmentalists, because oftentimes environmentalists don't think about the larger context, they only think about the crisis. But in Texas, there's like constant warfare, what we're dealing with. But sometimes it seems like leftists that I had been in contact with have been kind of oblivious or just really haven't been involved in environmental issues. So we're hoping that there'll be some cross-fertilization.
Absolutely. And I didn't talk about population, but I think I disagree that we have a population problem. I'm sure that's controversial here, but
That's
sorry.
just what I was going to bring up. I never hear anyone talking about overpopulation. I just wondered, like Julie, if that was talked about in Tunisia or...
No, it really wasn't.
Wow.
At least it could have been, but not in the particular workshops that I was attending. Okay? But I think there's a limit to growth on all fronts, and including human population. personally.
I didn't hear the word.
Including.
No, there's a what?
Yeah, there's limits to growth in all
Oh,
areas,
right.
including human population.
Okay.
That we can't continue to overpopulate. However, they are saying that it's starting to level off, and if, we have a sustainable lifestyle, the population levels should become sustainable and should level off. So, perhaps that's true. I just wouldn't want to, see us just having the population get so large that we cannot sustain life on the planet. So it's just,
Well, and that, yeah.
maybe there's-
Well, I mean, I don't think we're talking about an ultimately expanding human population, but it often, the population debate historically has often, and contemporary terms, has often turned extremely racist.
That's true.
So I think there are lots of issues wrapped up in the question of overpopulation. And in fact, if you look at the places where there are large areas of the world where population is falling, Europe amongst them, Italy is going through like possibly an 85% population drop, Australia, Russia, most of the European Union. And if you look at this week's issue of Time magazine, the front page is the child-free life, when having it all means not having children, because population is dropping in the United States. But despite those things, in all of those countries, in European Union and the US in particular, and Australia, carbon emissions are skyrocketing upwards. So there's actually no connection between population and carbon emissions. Where population is growing in countries like Niger and much of Africa, they produce almost no carbon, right? Outside of South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, the rest of Africa is responsible for so little. So you have to be very, very careful, I think, and very specific when you're talking about overpopulation. Who are you actually talking about?
But can they feed themselves, and are they going to have enough water?
Well, that then draws us into a whole other question. It's not to say that there aren't regional imbalances, but then that draws us into a whole question about, well, Africa actually used to be self-sufficient, the whole of Africa, in food and water, up until 30 years ago. What changed? It wasn't a huge population growth, but neoliberalism, the changing economics that said, you don't need to produce your own food. We will produce it for you, buy it from us, and we will erect trade barriers and drop yours, so that we can produce frozen offal in Eastern Europe. Smithfield does this. They can produce frozen offal in Eastern Europe and sell it to Sierra Leone cheaper than Sierra Leone farmers can produce fresh meat. So what do you think is going to happen to the farming industry in Sierra Leone as a result of that? So you have to have a much bigger perspective on it than just that. Sorry, Rachel wanted to say
No, I was
something.
just going to interject the point about population, and it's so integrally related to consumption levels. I mean, we have a consumption problem rather than a population problem, really, if we want to look at the root causes of all of the various crises that we're faced with. They are a problem of overconsumption, not a problem of the number of people. There's also a close link between those, where there's this thing, I think it's called the demographic transition or whatever, where the wealthier people are, the fewer children they have, and the higher their consumption levels are. So they're very tangled up with each other.
Go ahead.
There's one other link that between issues that many of us work on that I think is important to make is many of us who've worked on anti-war issues, nuclear disarmament issues and things over the years, I think we have to take a really close look at the whole concept of militarism in relation to the climate crisis and environmental crisis, because there definitely is a huge difference between the amount of resources that the military consumes, the amount of pollution and carbon releases that the military is responsible for, most of the United States, and also the fact that as a result of this climate change, there's already mass movements of people that are starting to move, and the migrations of people from drought-stricken areas, from flood areas, from coastal areas that are going to be flooded permanently from the rising oceans, is going to create tremendous chaos. And the Pentagon already gets this. And the Pentagon already has plans in place to try to keep a lid on the chaos, to protect the corporate interests of the United States around the world. And so it is very integrated. And So one thing that I'm trying to do, because my roots are in the peace and anti-war movements, is to really try to educate people that I know in those areas about how important it is for us to join forces with people in the climate movement and the environmental movement to see the links and to join forces. Because if we don't start pulling these issues together and working as a united force, we really are not going to be able to lick this baby, and it's going to take all of us.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, on that note, thanks very much. Rachel and I will be speaking on a panel on Saturday morning, which will be more focused on energy and some solutions to the energy problem. But I would say, to end on the same hopeful note that Julie mentioned, unlike previous years, it's almost common sense at this point. It's not a radical position to say that it is a systemic problem. It's not just about a few evil corporations or some bought-off CEOs or the odd, or the lobbying or anything like that. There is a systemic problem that goes way beyond Congress, way beyond the Democrats or the Republicans. And so once you start there, you're already way in advance of arguments that exist because people have already accepted that argument. So the next two questions immediately come up, right? Okay, so I'm convinced of that. How are we going to get rid of this system, capitalism? And just like Gara Popowitz quoted last night, there are more people under 30 in this country who view socialism positively, whatever they think that is, than capitalism. Because they know what capitalism is, and they certainly don't like that. So I think things are changing quite radically, and now we're in a position to say, well, we want to get rid of the system, how are we going to do it? Secondly, even more importantly perhaps, what do you want to replace it with? What society are you looking for? And so now I think is a good time to start articulating visions for a future sustainable and socially just society, the kind that's
Do you
worth-
recommend one being a socialist?
Oh, well, yes.
Has anyone written out what it would look like? I went to a workshop earlier today that had some good answers.
You can read the final two chapters of my book, which
What's your book
there a
called?
little bit. Ecology and Socialism: Solutions to Capitalist Ecological Crisis.
Oh God, that's a big long title.
It is.
But it's a good book.
Oh,
I read it. It's a
okay.
good book.
Just because a lot of environmental books or books on the environment, it's only the last 10 pages or so that you get to very inadequate. After 90% of the book is the chaos and the terror and the doom and the gloom, which is true. It's like the solutions offered are very short and not up to the task that they just described. So I wanted to write a book that was kind of half and half. Anyway. So thanks very much for it.
Thank you.
And if anyone wants to get on that email list,